Hello. You might wonder why I'm here in the forest filming. I'm here because restorative justice offers a forest of healing. In this forest, wise elders, the trees, gather all around, listening to us, to each other. They discern, they don't judge. They notice when harm occurs and work together to stave off further threats. Trees remain stationary, but they are far from passive. They have much to teach us about the ways we are connected and how our actions impact ourselves and each other. I have long thought of myself as a daughter of the trees, because with a name like Leaf, who wouldn't? I've titled this experience A Call for Tenderness, as a way to cultivate accountability and community. I'd like to share with you a process for that, and I begin with a poem by the 13th century German theologian Meister Eckhart. The poem is translated by Daniel Adensky. Love does that. All day long, a little burro labors, sometimes with heavy loads on her back, and sometimes just with worries about things that bother only burros. And worries, as we know, can be more exhausting than physical labor. Once in a while, a kind monk comes to her stable and brings a pear. But more than that, he looks into the burro's eyes and touches her ears. And for a few seconds, the burro is free and even seems to laugh, because love does that. Love frees. Take a moment to bring to being a time when you felt like the burro. Weary, worried, perhaps sore from your labor or an injury to body or spirit. Just breathe into that moment and feel the tenderness. Feel where the tenderness shows up in your body. And exhale, and just stay in the moment. And now bring into being someone in that moment who functioned like the kindly monk. When have you been met with the tenderness offered as gently as the monk who brings the sweetness and nourishment and a soothing gesture? Breathe into how it feels, that bite of fresh pear, the gentlest caress. Just feel that in your body and exhale. Now, bring into being a moment when you were the kindly monk, when you offered the pear, when you gently met the worried and weary, aching tenderness of another with your own. Just breathe into that feeling. And exhale. If any of you watching could not bring to being your analog of the kindly monk with a pear who touches the burro's ears and perhaps the velvet nose so gently, I invite you to take a moment to notice how that awareness lands in your body. We experience tenderness and the lack of it in our bodies. The great philosopher, theologian, writer, intellectual Cornel West says, tenderness is what justice looks like in private. Tenderness is what justice looks like in private. Tenderness becomes an intimate embodiment of justice. Justice written on the body. I've noticed in my work in prisons, where I have met my greatest teachers, that many folks who are identified and classified and defined as perpetrators of harm have not received much tenderness. Incarceration is antithetical to it. Without the opportunity to receive tenderness with some regularity, it's near impossible to offer it, to know how it feels in the body. And because we can't always count on others around us to provide it, we need to learn how to offer it to ourselves. That's why self-compassion is an essential practice and requisite for accountability. I invite you to consider your own relationship with accountability. Call to being your worst transgression, an act of omission or commission that still pains you or evokes regret or remorse. And notice what goes on in your body as you call that moment or that experience into being. What allows you to be accountable, to fully face the harm you caused, to be able to hear the full extent of the impact of your action or inaction, when every fiber of your being wants to scream, "But that wasn't my intent"? Or maybe it was, because sometimes we hurt others to make them experience the pain we feel because we need our pain acknowledged. For me, accountability doesn't just rely on my capacity to empathize with the person I've harmed, to recognize their humanity and worth. It begins with my capacity to recognize my own humanity and worth. Frankly, if I fundamentally experience myself as unworthy, not enough, bad, sinful, shameful, and I can't distinguish between my action and my being, accountability is either unbearable because I can only see my action as further evidence of my immutable unworthiness and unbelonging, and therefore I reject accountability, or else it's impossible because the state of disconnection prevents me from connecting with the humanity or the pain of the other person I've harmed. What allows me to face my transgressions, the moments I disappoint myself by not behaving in alignment with my values, is the capacity to meet myself with compassion instead of condemnation. A wonderful, wise friend of mine gave me this line years ago, and I live by it. It is only in an uncondemned state that any of us can change. If I am filled with shame, I can't admit what I've done because it's too painful. Shame eviscerates a sense of self-worth and belonging, reconfirming the belief that I don't matter, and thus my actions don't matter. So why be responsible? Why take responsibility for the harm I've caused you if my actions and I don't matter? So let me share a story with you about a transgression I regret. I've been teaching college writing for a long time, almost 30 years. I consider myself a good instructor. I have excellent marks on rateyourprofessor.com. And the way I teach is that I would have students who will write a draft of a research essay, and I will spend between an hour and an hour and a half per draft. So when I have 40 students in a semester, that means on the week I receive a draft, I've got to dedicate 40 to 50 hours just reading and responding to their work. And I've tried to simplify it and I've tried to spend less time, but I never have managed in all these years teaching. And I remember I would look over at my poor dog, my big German Shepherd, and she'd be crossing her legs thinking, Mama, you got to take me out. I got to go pee. And I'd be like, I have to finish this paper. So I was super dedicated to getting these papers done. So it was really important the weeks those papers were due that the students turned them in on time. Now I was really flexible about late work on other assignments, but these papers I needed to get read over spring break when I could devote my entire attention to them. So the students got to go off on spring break and relax or party or do whatever, and I was hunkered down with a stack of papers like this. So that particular week, I was so disappointed because about 2/3 of my students turned their papers in on time, which meant that 1/3 did not. So I had a lot of papers that I didn't get read. That meant that the next week when classes were back in session and I had so much other stuff to do, I was going to have to cram in reading and responding to those papers. And I was ticked off. I was really frustrated. So I go back to school and I return the papers I have, and I'm thinking those students who didn't turn in their drafts, they sure better have them today because I am ticked off. I had this one particular student named Will, who I knew the first week of the semester was a great student, and he bore that out as the semester went on. He was thoughtful, respectful, super bright, great writer, deep thinker, and I have to tell you, I was horrified that Will had not turned in his draft. So when I got back after spring break and I returned the papers I had, and Will walks in the classroom maybe a moment late, and I say, Will, where's your draft? You didn't give me your draft. And he said, I didn't have it. And I went off on Will. I went up one side of Will. I went down the other side of Will. I just lost my cookies. I was just raging at poor Will. And he sat there, and I had lost control. Like I had flipped my lid. My prefrontal cortex had totally gone offline. And I was totally in my lizard brain. And finally, when I paused long enough to take a breath, Will looked at me and said, Leaf, there's a way to talk to people respectfully without humiliating them in front of a group of people. And you're not doing that. So I'm going to leave now. Good evening. And just like that, Will got up and stepped out of class. And as soon as he started speaking, it snapped me out of my rage, and I was horrified. I was so embarrassed. I couldn't believe what I had just done, and I loved Will. I mean, we're not supposed to have favorite students, but he was one. And he left, and unfortunately, I just wanted to bolt after him and apologize, but I had other students in the class, and I needed to attend to them and carry on. So I knew I had to wait, and I just felt horrible about the whole situation. And on the way home, I'm thinking to myself, Leaf, what happened? And here's the critical part of the story. What allowed me to be accountable, not just to Will, but to the entire class, who also had to experience this really unpleasant outbreak and see their instructor behave in a way that was not in alignment with my values. What allowed me to do that was to know that I am that compassionate and dedicated teacher who makes mistakes. And when I was able to really drop down inside myself and say, okay, Leaf, so what was going on? What did I need in that moment that went unmet? What was the unmet need? And I realized that, gee, I arranged my schedule to read all the student essays, and I felt like my diligence had gone unappreciated. And I wanted someone to feel my pain, or at least my aggravation. I could take responsibility for lashing out, and I could make amends. And as I drove home, I thought about all that. And I thought about how if this had happened 10 or 15 years before, I would have been so filled with shame for what I'd done that I would have ended up having to externalize that by blaming the student, somehow making it his fault because, his paper was late. It was not even just a week late. It was going to be more than a week late. But instead of having to do that, I could practice self-compassion and offer my tender spot some tenderness. Because I could say, Leaf, you do work hard, and you do spend an inordinate amount of time and energy reading and responding to your students' papers. And of course, you want your students to appreciate that and respect you by turning in their essays on time. And unfortunately, you let that unmet need for acknowledgement go unchecked until you exploded. And thankfully, you have the opportunity to apologize and make amends. And of course, that's what I did. I not only wrote Will a long email of apology, I wrote a long letter to every student in the class and apologized for my behavior. The year I spent as a jail chaplain, listening to folks in jail tell me how the system screwed them or set them up or how whatever they did was someone else's fault, reminded me of my own capacity for denial and blame, rooted in shame. But there was more to it. Underneath the shame of causing harm was the unmet need for acknowledgement of the losses and indignities, the grief and the pain and the trauma accrued. And that was true for every single person I met in the jail. Our capacity to practice shame resilience depends on consistently experiencing a sense of inherent worth, belonging, and security. We need a safe container that allows vulnerability without impending threat. The perception of danger activates that fight, flight, or freeze response. Shame triggers the limbic system and shuts down the prefrontal cortex. A sense of isolation signals threat and reinforces shame so that we need warm accompaniment. We need tenderness to know we're not alone or unique in our grief and our fear and the messiness of being human. A key part of restorative justice practice has to be the capacity to practice self-compassion, to understand trauma and its effects neurobiologically. We are hardwired for preservation, self-preservation, and connection. Nonviolent communication trainer and interpersonal neurobiology educator Sarah Payton teaches about the sacred vows or family contracts we make when we are very young beings to preserve alignment with our parents or primary caregivers we depend on for survival as children. Even before we're capable of abstract thought, we recognize what behaviors we must adopt in order to preserve that relationship with those responsible for keeping us alive, and we do so at all costs. The vow or the contract we commit to at an early age then shapes adaptations that we carry into adulthood. Now, often those adaptations, though deeply ingrained, no longer serve us. And here's an example. I noticed well into my 30s and 40s, even my 50s, that I was super self-conscious of making any bodily sound, of my body emitting any noise that might express a need. I mean, everybody can be a little self-conscious, but I was just filled with that white-hot shame. A little flatulence, a little belch, any kind of sound sent me over the edge. I hated public bathrooms, oh my God. I would dehydrate before I got on an airplane. I didn't eat on a plane. That I should have to use the lavatory, please no. So this is pretty extreme, and when I was a young woman, I went to a women's music festival out on the land where there were nothing but a few porta potties and a lot of woods. And it was a vegetarian diet, and it was the year before I became a vegetarian, so I wasn't used to all the fruits and vegetables. And my guts were really roiling by day 3, but I was just terrified to have to use the bathroom. Well, there wasn't really a bathroom, but I was really dreading having to finally eliminate anything from my body. And I finally had to say to myself, Leaf, your mother already lost one child because my brother had died at 18. And I thought, she can't lose another child because you're afraid to poop out in the woods. So you got to do something here. So I broke down. But I couldn't figure out my whole life, like, why was I so uncomfortable and self-conscious about this? And it wasn't until I was doing a trauma workshop in my late 50s and I was telling a story that it all connected. When I was a tiny baby, my parents hired a nursemaid to help with my care. And one day my mother was down in the kitchen doing whatever she was doing in the kitchen. The nursemaid was upstairs in our house with me in the nursery. And there was an intercom system. So there was a speaker up in the nursery and then a speaker in the kitchen so my mother could hear what was going on while she was out of the room. And somewhere in there she noticed that it was deathly quiet up in the nursery. And usually babies make a little bit of sound. If they're not crying, they might be cooing or gurgling, and it was just dead silence. So my mother rushed upstairs, burst into the nursery, and found the nursemaid standing over my crib with a pillow over my head, pushing down on the pillow, suffocating me. And if my mother hadn't gotten there really within seconds, I would have suffocated. Now, probably what happened was that the nursemaid, who in fact had unfortunately a drug problem and had been stealing medication from some of her elderly clients, which of course we didn't realize at the time. So whatever her story was, probably though, I had been fussing and making noise. I was a colicky baby. I had a lot of gas, and probably she was not liking the noises I was making. And so she just thought if she put a pillow over my head, all the noises would cease. Well, I had no cognitive memory of that. But my body remembered in every cell that literally to make a sound related to biological need could be lethal. And so I carried that adaptation without understanding why well into my 40s or 50s. And then I realized, oh, that's why I'm so self-conscious and shame-ridden when I make any kind of sound, or even when I want to express a need verbally, because to express a need could be deadly. So that's a kind of example of how we can carry these adaptations without even realizing it. So trauma breaks a connection. It breaks a connection with our own bodies, with each other. Situations are traumatizing because we feel endangered and alone in that danger, even if others are present. Trauma creates a kind of self-annihilation. A maladaptive way to reverse the experience of self-annihilation is to annihilate or try to annihilate another, because I must exist if I can annihilate you. If we understand at our core that we are all beings who from infancy must navigate survival, and we recognize that the harm we cause often results from adaptations that arise from abuse, neglect, and trauma, we can meet that part of ourselves with compassion while simultaneously holding ourselves accountable. And in my little story, I could say with compassion, Leaf, of course you've spent your life being afraid to make a sound, to use words to say what you need, because when you were a tiny baby, your body was silenced and you almost died. So that compassion, that tenderness for myself allows me to then say, okay, now as an adult, I have some accountability. I know that I'm not under threat. So I can choose to nurture myself and care for myself and practice self-compassion and love by saying, gosh, I make sounds like other people and other animals. That's just what mammals do. And gosh, I can ask for what I need. That's okay. So accountability can return us to a place of connection. And as Danielle Sarid points out in her fabulous book, Until We Reckon, Violence, Mass Incarceration, and a Road to Repair, it's the process of accountability that rehumanizes us. Because when we cause harm to ourselves or another, that's a process of dehumanizing. If I hurt you, I dehumanize you. And when I can be accountable for my harm and make amends, I rehumanize myself and you. When the initial source of connection coalesces around harm, the pain of that can drive those responsible for the harm into hiding, denial, blame, or shame. Accountability offers another path. When we bear witness to the suffering we cause, providing the acknowledgement necessary for the person we harm to begin the healing process, and we commit to ongoing amends, we revitalize our own humanity as well as the other person's. Extending tenderness to the most tender places within us allows us to recognize that others have tender places too. When we can remember, when we can bring back into being the Boro in ourselves, when we can remember and bring into being those moments where we have received tenderness, then we're able to meet those tender places with compassion and offer ourselves warm accompaniment first, so that then we can extend warm accompaniment to others. And with warm accompaniment and tenderness, our defensiveness relaxes, literally in our bodies, and our prefrontal cortex can re-engage, which allows our capacity for language and cognition necessary to process complex thoughts. When that returns, we can really be much more functional, and we no longer feel threatened. When we receive adequate empathy, we can extend it to those we harm. In the absence of our own experience receiving empathy, we're unable to give it, because trauma interrupts the mirror neuron activity in the anterior cingulate cortex that allows us to experience another's plight as our own. Then it disrupts our capacity to empathize. Now, trauma therapists understand that telling stories releases shame and can shift the way mirror neurons work in the brain. And as restorative justice practitioners, we want the people who cause harm to be accountable. And that begins with empathy, first for the self and then for the other. But if a person's neurobiology disallows empathy, we must work with those individuals to first restore that mirror neuron activity. While we recognize the importance of those who are victimized telling their story, naming the hurt, if in a pre-conference conversation we fail to give the people who cause harm an opportunity to tell their stories of previous traumatization, we risk a missed opportunity to heal that interrupted mirror neuron activity necessary for empathy. So part of our work is to make sure that the people who cause harm have that opportunity to heal that interrupted mirror neuron circuit. And part of that process means that we have to make sure our own mirror neuron activity is functioning well. Ultimately, the most satisfying accountability emerges knowing while we cannot undo the harm we cause, we can, with neuroplasticity, learn a different way of being, and we can avoid repeating the harm. Danielle Sarid and other restorative justice practitioners report that what people who've been victimized want and need most is to know they will not experience the harm again. So ensuring the highest level of accountability affords the greatest chance of meeting that fundamental need. This is why it's also so important to have community accountability. As community members, we need to be accountable for the systems we create, tolerate, maintain, and promote that breed trauma. We need to hold ourselves accountable for structural violence in its myriad forms. If we focus solely on the behavior of an individual without examining what's occurring upstream, we collude in systems that perpetuate harm and offload our responsibility for it. Restorative justice asks that we not simply repair the harm right here, but that we restore or perhaps create a community where all members can flourish. Self-compassion and tenderness do not excuse or condone harmful actions. Rather, they cultivate the capacity for accountability. As practitioners and specifically for those of us who facilitate restorative justice circles. To hold space for others, we need to hold it for ourselves. We must meet our own needs for tenderness because we know the restorative justice process, the conversations, the circles, can challenge us to deal with our own inner landscapes, our own forest of healing. When we can discern without judgment, we give others in the circle permission to do the same. Together we create a brave container for compassion. And that compassion will create the space for accountability. Research shows that forest trees have evolved to live in cooperative, interdependent relationships maintained by communication and a collective intelligence. Restorative practices help humans do the same. Let's cultivate our forests of healing with tenderness and manifest justice in and with our bodies. Thanks for listening.